Mr. President, Mr. Wu, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. One good thing, perhaps the only good thing I can say about my having been invited here, is that it's a strong indicator that, contrary to common belief, there are risk takers in the United Nations system. And I would like to thank you for taking the risk. After I've finished, you may regret it. Could I start by just asking you if you could raise hands just to see who we are in the room? And I realize that quite a lot of you are right at the back. According to where you come from, you can raise the hand more than once if you wish. I'd written down here risk takers, but no, that's not right. LDCs. Who's from an LDC? LDCs? Only one. LDCs, right? LDCs. BRICS. BRICS, yes. Middle-income countries. I mean, other ones. Oh, that's quite a lot, isn't it? That's interesting. DAC donors. Yes, scattered around. Members of Parliament. At the back, but you're not really at the back. International agencies. Not meant. Oh yes, they're clustered over here, right? CSOs, all at the back. No, not all. Almost all at the back. Academia, if that's a category, yes. Foundations, yes. And the private sector. Two. Well, two from the private sector. Welcome. What have I missed? Oh, yes. G7 plus. G7 plus. Good. Now, let me get down to business. I should say, having asked you who you are, who I am, I've been a nomad in my life, and to ingratiate myself with you, that's to say, to show that I can understand your difficulties and points of view, I have to say that as a nomad, I have worked in a government agency, I have worked in the UN, I have worked in academia, I've worked in a funding foundation, and I've worked in a training institute. And I've had to move on from time to time for reasons which you can imagine. Also, I've been wrong in the past about things, and I may be wrong about some of the things I say now. I think many of you will disagree with a lot of what I'm going to say, and I think that's very healthy. I like the saying of the philosopher Karl Popper, who said, you may be right, and I may be wrong, and by an effort together, we may get closer to the truth. And that's the spirit in which I'm talking now. The other thing I have to tell you, and this, I must confess, is somewhat unconventional as a way of starting. But I take as my text a graffiti, a toilet graffiti from the Institute of Development Studies where I work. We have a brilliant new director, Melissa Leach, and we're all very, very excited, and we're trying to reimagine ourselves. And someone put up a sheet, when I was sitting on the loo, someone had put up a sheet with flip chart, and it said this: "Hi, hope you are enjoying this moment of peace and relief. I am IDS's conscience. Please help me to reimagine myself." And underneath that, somebody wrote, "Let's speak truth to power." And someone else wrote underneath that, "Sure, if somebody will fund it." And this is part of the problem, I think, the dilemma that we face in development is that power and power relations go with funding. And this pervades almost everything and distorts very, very many things and very many relationships. Now, I'm going to cover four things. I'm going to say why I think this is a thrilling time for all of us working in development and development cooperation. I'm going to point to some challenges. I'm going to indicate some of the things that I think we're learning, some of which are quite heretical. And then finally, areas for focus and for action. First of all, I've written down here, forgive me, bloody exciting time. I do think this is a thrilling time, and I think it's thrilling for three reasons. The first is the post-MDG vision, and you just heard the Secretary General calling for far-reaching vision. I think there's a wonderful opportunity, this idea of a universal, unified set of agreements, the idea of transforming almost everything, the idea that inequalities, both within countries and between countries, are something that should be monitored and should be, if possible, reduced. These and other aspects, I think, are very, very exciting and give us a tremendous opportunity. The second is that I think that change in almost every dimension is accelerating. It's accelerating for us in many ways, which we know, particularly around communications and how we work. But also accelerating for poor people, the people that we're meant to be working for. Things are changing for them more rapidly than they used to. And that means that we have more of a struggle to keep up with them. But it also makes it very exciting. Thirdly, the new relationships and developments in development cooperation. The rising powers, as they're sometimes called, the South-South cooperation, the new relationships between DAC donors and those who they're funding. New ways of relating, and particularly the potential for horizontal relationships. And this is where I think the G7 Plus is something that we can learn from. I'm just going to ask you, are East Timor and Guinea-Bissau here? If you are, could you raise your hands? Oh, they're not. That's a shame, because East Timor has been helping Guinea-Bissau by visiting Guinea-Bissau and advising from their experience about post-conflict. And this sort of collaboration, and I see Togo here nodding your head, sir. This sort of cooperation is a wonderful thing, these sorts of exchanges, because they're not associated with power. Where there's funding, there's power, and that tends to distort a great deal. And I think one of the big challenges for South-South cooperation is not to allow that to be distorting. So we're looking for a new narrative, as the Secretary General called. So that's the first thing, why this is a very, very exciting time. The second one is the nature of the challenges that we face. And here I think there's a big issue around language and what language means, and the hypocrisy with which we use language, in the sense that there's a big gap between what the language seems to be saying and the reality. I think another challenge is about myths and misperceptions, that about relationships, particularly funding relationships, we like to have myths. We like to believe that things are better than they really were. And speaking truth to power, where there's a vertical funding relationship, may happen, but it very often doesn't happen, and what is filtered up is distorted. So there are misperceptions. Sometimes people say all power deceives. I want to ask, are we in development cooperation a bit like frogs in a pot? You must know about frogs in a pot. The frogs are in a pot. The pot is heating up, but it heats up gradually, and so they don't really notice anything's happening. They don't jump out, and eventually they boil because they haven't woken up. And I want to ask you, do you recognize this? Because I think that we are frogs in a pot. Let me explain. Participation was big in the 90s. When we had a meeting in the World Bank, we had 350 people came to a morning workshop. Participation was really big. Poor people were primary stakeholders. That's all gone. That's something lost in the past. The 2000s, there was a paradigm shift from people to things. And we now are living and working with a language which fits things rather than people. And then ways of working which are relative to things rather than people. Now, it works with big infrastructure. It works reasonably well. But in other contexts, I think it's misapplied. And I think it's reflected in a lot of the language that we use now. Let me take an example. If you take the Paris Declaration, which seems to be regarded as a sort of tablets from heaven, you know, that's the ultimate by many people. But I went through the Paris Declaration to see the words which were used most often. And they sound fine to you. To monitor, this is an imaginary sentence made up, to monitor indicators of effective performance from aid, donors and partners need the capacity to manage the mutual harmonization of programs to assess, measure, and report on results. Now that's all motherhood nowadays, but what about the words which were never used? There's never used in the Paris Declaration. Agreement, evolve, negotiate, power, relationship, poor, or people. People are not mentioned. It's in the things paradigm, a mechanistic Newtonian paradigm. Last night I did some field research, yesterday evening, in the preparatory meeting of the friends of this meeting. And I counted the numbers of times words were used by the speakers. I wonder what you think was the most common word. Anyway, I haven't got time for participation because I'm going to run out of time. But the most commonly used word was the same as the most commonly used word in the Paris Declaration. And it is partnership. But once you start unpacking partnership, we have to ask ourselves what we find there. The next most common was accountability, and then sustainable development and effectiveness together. Transparency was way down, and words which were not used were low level, grassroots, equality, inequality, procedures, radical, relationship, ownership, people, behavior, complexity, attitude, or mindset. Those were not used yesterday, and it's not a criticism for me to say this. I hope you realize that. I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying that this is what happens in this sort of context. But these are things which are very, very important if development is going to be done well, and if development cooperation is going to be done well. The question about frogs in a pot is whether gradually the language has been changing and the realities have been changing, and these have been changing the relationships that we all have. So we had the log frame. We have words like targets, milestones, indicators, results-based management, value for money, accountability, which tends to be upward accountability. There's a very good accountability study, though, which is part of the papers for this meeting. Most recently, in my own country, payment by results is being introduced as a forward-looking frontier. I have grave reservations about payment by results. I think it fits in a Newtonian view of reality, when in fact what we're living in is in a complex world. And it talks about partners being more incentivized to deliver. Deliver's another word which we never used 10 years ago. Deliver tends to be, it's a word which implies supply, when in fact what we want is participatory interaction and flexibility. Flexibility is the word which comes in, but in fact, these are top-down developments which may be not cost-effective at all. Exactly the opposite. Do we need, I've called them the 3 T's, that a way forward is through trust, and I'm delighted that the Secretary General was using the word trust several times. Trust, transparency, and truth. If there is trust and if there is transparency, then truth will very often follow, the three T's. We're living in complexity. We're living in a world which is unpredictable and rapidly changing, a world of white water. I would like to challenge the DAC to do a study, or rather to commission an independent study, if it hasn't already been done, of the actual effects of the conditionalities, and again the Secretary General, in the most diplomatic way, mentioned that sometimes the conditions attached to aid may be not quite right. To challenge the DAC to do a study of the effects of the conditions. Oh my God. You see, hopeless, you'd never ask an old man to talk. Anyway, challenge. Do a study of the conditions and of the impact of those conditions right through to the grassroots in terms also of reporting. So let me mention also that part of this trap, is there a capital trap? How many of you are from capital cities? How many of you live and work in capital cities? It's practically everybody. And I'm not surprised. That's perfectly natural. I mean, and understandable. It's not a criticism. But is there a capital trap? Are people actually traveling less out from capital cities than they were before? That's a question. How many of us have stayed for a night or 2 nights in a community, a poor community, in the last 2 years? Oh, well done. It's more than I expected. I had to say 2 years because the last time I did it was over a year ago. So, what are we learning? I want to give you 3 sources that I strongly recommend. This book, Time to Listen. Please, please, who's got the book or read it? Has anybody got Time to Listen? Have you even heard of it? You can download it for free. It's discussions with 6,000 people who have been recipients of aid in one way or another. Very open discussions and what their feedback is. And this is the real thing, I think, coming through. It's a brilliant book. I don't think any of us should work in development without having this book and reading it. And Google for it and download it. What they found was aid is appreciated. There's too much too fast. It's too time-bound. Procedures and reporting are onerous and actually make it less effective. They want direct relationships with the donors, face-to-face relationships, and that means more staff, I may say. Donor agencies have tended to reduce staff. They need more staff, in my view, and fewer managers, and more people who are competent and experienced in development. So they want this personal contact. So that's Time to Listen. The next one is Turning the World Upside Down. This is a former head of the National Health Service in the UK who was sent by Tony Blair to pass on the good messages about how wonderful the health service was, you know, that other countries might learn. He ended up by learning far more than he was passing on, and has written this book about what he learned. And it was particularly about the relationship with patients that he learned and picked up. So Turning the World Upside Down. And the last thing I want to mention is, we'll go straight to the last one, is reality checks, which many of you may not have heard of. but you can Google for this, and you've got the website is up there. Do go to this website. This is something which I think every country should have. This is where researchers, young researchers usually, go and spend a week in representative communities around the country and then come together and find out and share what they've been doing. I think Britain should have this. I think all the DAC countries should have this. I think it should spread all over the world. It's absolutely brilliant. And if you go to this website, you can download some of what they've done. Now, concluding, I've got I've got 4 Ps. The first P is partnership. Do we need to unpack partnership? Maybe another vocabulary is needed. It seems to be used as a euphemism again and again. I've even seen in one of these reports, the accountability report, it talks about donors and their partners, and then saying their partners, but the donors are not the partners. It's only one way round. Do we need to reverse learning? Do we need to concentrate on relationships? So that's the first one. The second one is procedures. Are procedures becoming very, very limiting? Is it as though we're asking people to run an obstacle course, but insisting that they wear a straitjacket? I suspect it's a bit like that. But it also leads to pretense and to misleading information. Is there a need to radically simplify, which is possible with trust and possible with more personal contact? And there's experience with doing that. The third one is really critical and hardly ever gets mentioned, and this is the personal dimension. One of the findings, as I mentioned, was from Time to Listen, was that wherever there'd been something really good happening, there'd always been a person. They said without exception in the book, and that's a huge number of interviews, there was always a person. Does this mean that we need to be much more careful about who we recruit, who we train, that we recruit people who've got an ability to listen, not just to talk, but also to listen? Do we need more time for reflection? Do we need grassroots immersions, which the World Bank used to be doing and still is to some extent? Germany has been great leaders and still are doing immersions. Is that personal dimension something which we neglect? And do we need more staff? The trend, I've been arguing this for 30 years. I've been arguing as agencies are reducing their staff and increasing their budgets. It's crazy. In fact, one of our ministers, before he became the minister, Andrew Meacher, he twice said in public that it was ridiculous, but it didn't change when he became the minister. More staff. And people will cry bureaucracy and all the rest of it, but actually it's the cost effectiveness of the total budget that matters. And all the indications are that good staff are really, really critical. And then there's a fourth P. I wonder if you can guess what the fourth P is. Well, I mean, you may think power or participation or something or other. No, it's passion. We need people with passion and with conviction and with guts, people who will get in there and stick in there, because it's people who make difference. It's people like you who can make a huge, huge difference if you really decide to, if you're really committed to the post-MDG agenda. So passion is the last, but then there are 5 fingers. So maybe there should be a fifth. And the fifth one I've written down here is privilege. For me, a privilege to have been invited here for these 2 days. For all of us, I think a privilege to be engaged in such an enormously important enterprise with such huge potential for human well-being. We, as powerful people in different ways, we are incredibly privileged. And privileged also, if we if we recognize that the system has to change, and it means looking at things like procedures and staffing in new ways. And if it doesn't change, then, and if we don't manage, if the South-South, we can learn a lot from South-South cooperation, but let that not also make the same mistakes or fall into the same traps. Let's all of us learn together. And relationships are absolutely critical. So finally, I must stop expressing and embodying, with apologies to the United Kingdom, my national culture of hypocrisy. And do what I say, which is these two slogans are really powerful. Ask them and listen. And in order to listen, you have to shut up. So it's time for me to put my bottom where my mouth says it should be and go and sit down and shut up.